Warning, this video is not meant for children. It's meant for a mature audience, as this video has mature themes such as blood, violence, sex references, and inappropriate language. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at something different. Today we're going to be taking a look at the evolution of horror from all the way from 1896 to 2021. And it's just hit me. This video is going to be outdated in 12 days. Whatever, we'll keep going. Just before we get into the video, I just want to quickly talk about what's going to happen with the Curse of Chucky review and also with the other reviews. Essentially, I'm not going to be reviewing movie franchises like I've been doing with Child's Play. I started the franchise 4 months ago and we're only 5 out of 9 bits of content, not even including the ranked video. It's just taken far too long, and with these, they're very generic. They don't have much of an identity outside of trying to do little gimmicks. Like, for example, with Cedar Chucky, I had a vision to make it a parody rant type video. With Curse of Chucky, I've got nothing. I've got nothing to make it stand out, and I'd rather take the time to make it so it stands out and make it so Child's Play is the only franchise that I rank the entire franchise, review them all like that, like I've been doing. So now I'm going to start focusing more videos like this, like the evolution of horror. I want to start focusing on individual movies in random franchises, why insert movie is the best out of the franchise, why insert movie is a disaster, why insert movie is the best of its kind type thing. Ranking videos is a good one. That's going to be one that I'll be taking over. And overviews of franchises and stuff like that, just to replace the reviews. Anyway, why don't we just get into the evolution of horror, shall we? Let's start with the first decade, 1890s. Alright, the first ever horror movie was created in 1896 called The House of the Devil. This was actually a French film, 3 minutes long, a short film, but technically it's still classified as the first ever horror film ever made. But for this video, a lot of foreign films exist, so we're going to go with the English name. Fun fact, this movie was actually lost for multiple decades. In fact, it only re-emerged as the first ever horror film created in 1988. So for the longest time, we actually thought movies from 1920s to 30s, or even 40s. Okay, not 40s, we knew about Frankenstein. But back then, we thought those were the first ever horror movies created. But then we realised there was a whole new set, and those re-emerged in a film archive all the way in New Zealand, 1988. The more you know. In fact, the director, George Méliès, actually kind of started the entirety of horror. We got movies such as The Terrible Night and A Nightmare, and A Nightmare actually sticks out because it was the first ever dream sequence used in any film in history, and also the first use of psychological horror. He also made another film called The Bewitched Inn from 1997. This movie was actually the first movie to have objects come alive as the horror factor, along with another film called The Cave of the Demons. Wow. Man, horror MVP right there. His work also inspired another director to make a movie called Photographing a Ghost in 1898, which was also the first ever paranormal subgenre type movie, which doesn't become prominent until later on in the history, but this was actually the first ever one. Finally, to finish off this decade, horror started to re-emerge over in Japan as well. That's the main information to take from this. There's no point saying the names and all that crap. It's just horror was starting to go a little bit more global now, not just in Germany and England. Alright, 1900s now. To be honest, there's not much happening here. It's just George continuing to make more films, rising the popularity, and more people were starting to use horror as more of experimental with camera work. Because you've got to remember, the beginning of the 1900s was still when cinema was first being discovered. Silent film was relatively new at this point, so horror was mainly used to experiment with camera rather than actually experiment with the genre as a whole. And that's pretty much it. There was just an increase in horror films, so that's why this is called The Rise of Horror. Well, the beginning of the rise of horror, because they're starting to increase, but not much has actually changed in terms of what movies were like, who did what, etc. It was just becoming slowly more and more popular. Let's go on to the next decade. Not much happens this decade, except the fact that we get the first ever feature-length horror film. It's also the first ever feature-length Italian film called Inferno. Last thing actually worth mentioning about this decade is just we got the first ever adaptation of Frankenstein. It's not the one we know. We'll get to that when we get to the 30s. But yeah, nothing really happens in this decade. But next decade, a lot happens there. Why don't we go to the next decade, eh? Here we go, Expressionism. For a bit of context, Expressionism was caused by World War I, the pain and suffering, and basically the style as a whole is about the subconscious mind and how the world is presented like that physically. And Jesus Christ. Like, look at this shit. This is absolutely terrifying. In fact, I guess you could consider Expressionism as the first ever trend that horror went through. We also have the monster trend, the slasher trend, the comedy trend. I guess this is the first of its kind, and I don't like it. That movie was called The Cabin of Dr. Caligari, and what is actually very interesting is America kind of did the complete opposite. They were starting to focus more on realism, so there was kind of a clash of styles. American horror films tried to be more realistic, whereas expressionistic German and European films was significantly more, well, expressionistic and more terrifying. Blends of these two styles also started to occur with Nefisto. Is that my... Nosferatu? It's the first ever version of Dracula. Well, I guess the first ever more famous version of Dracula. And these were also a mix of realistic monster and expressionism. Yeah, things were getting weird. Another thing that happened in this decade was the first ever monster film, which the trend doesn't carry on until the following decade. Spoiler, I guess. But this movie was called The Golem. Another thing to also mention is an adaptation of A Hunchback of Notre Dame, which was the first ever horror film to get a budget of $1 million. Finally, we have a kind of iconic horror film actually coming out. The first one so far, I would say, and that is The Phantom of the Opera. It originally released in 1925, but then got re-released in 1930, which is the one we know nowadays with a more modern soundtrack that made significantly more money and became a lot more popular. Anyway, I think it's time for the next decade. This era changed horror permanently. This was the decade where horror was finally plummeted into the actual big leads. You had your romance, your sci-fi action, whatever crap was going on. Horror finally became one of those massive genres, and that's because of these monster films. This was the decade where horror really started to get its own identity. It wasn't just the first horror film, the first feature-length horror film, the first horror movie to get $1 million budget. Finally, it's starting to get its own footing, starting to make its own identity and separate itself from film. Because Expressionism, yeah, it impacted horror, but the whole thing, like, Expressionism caught on to every film at the time, really, due to what was going on. Horror now has its own identity. It's not just following the same thing that the rest of the films are, and this continues for the rest of horror's history. It continues. Constant trends are coming in and out, switching out horror, meaning I could stop naming all these specific details because it is so hard to explain. But yes, horror has finally got its own identity with the monster era. But what are those monster movies? Frankenstein, The Werewolf of London, Dracula, The Invisible Man, and The Mummy. These movies were massive. The characters that come from them are iconic as hell. Horror and just the world in and of itself is completely redefined by the fact that these movies were so popular. In fact, what happens in the next decade? Surely something massive has got to happen, right? Wait, what? Yep, as quickly as they came around, the monsters would pretty much delve into irrelevancy again, which is very weird considering how iconic these monsters are nowadays. Let me explain. Essentially, because of how popular they were, they ended up causing mass amounts of monster movies, and also sequels of them to be made, to make money. This caused them to be very, very, very drained. Just constant money, and it got formulaic, it got predictable. Things weren't scary anymore. People didn't actually care about these monsters anymore. And another thing that happened was censorship. Due to people being retards back then, they thought that these monster movies would incline people to imitate them, or even believe that they were real. So they got heavily censored, so they couldn't even try to change up the formula that much. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, good while it lasted. Other than that, nothing really happened in this thing. It was just a massive blow to the monster genre. And overall, that's probably why we just don't see it much nowadays, just because of how quickly it flopped. Even though we're starting to get stuff like The Invisible Man, so you never know. Might make a comeback. Anyway, I think we should go on to the next decade then. Yeah, horror was on the brink of death. With monster movies no longer working, horror just didn't have its footing anymore. Instead, they opted for more realistic-based stuff on people's lives because of World War II. This did not catch on. In fact, horror almost died. Most stars at the time were actually refusing to do horror films. Horror films became the low-budget go-to film if you had nothing else to do. which is sad because of the ultimate high that it had in the 30s. Horror movies were now based on the fear of technology, which, me just saying that sounds ridiculous, and they were. They didn't catch on, they didn't do well, they just did awfully. Horror is in ruin right now, and almost died. It's so weird to think that 20 years prior it was at an all-time high, now it's at an all-time low. I think we're just going to have to go on to the next genre here, because nothing really happens other than the fact that horror almost died. These next few decades were absolutely massive for horror for coming back from such an all-time low. Essentially, what happened is directors and people that were actually passionate about the genre didn't let the fact that they were known as low budget get to them. They utilized it. Movies such as The Night of the Living Dead, Psycho, The Birds, and Black Sunday. These movies were absolutely massive and responsible for bringing horror back into the light that it used to be. While there wasn't like a massive increase in popularity, one thing these movies did do was they did well on a low budget, and also what they decided to do was start focusing more on quality over quantity, which was very much appreciated at the time, because at the time Hollywood was just busting movie, so many movies, so much quantity over quality that it really caused things to get really stale. So the fact that horror was trying to stick outside of this really helped them in the time that they were in need. The one movie I do want to quickly talk about before we go on to the next genre is Psycho. Psycho is the first of a slasher genre that we call the slasher genre. This becomes massive later on, and although Psycho may not be the first, it was definitely the first popular one, and definitely the one that caused a recoil effect for the next few decades. Anyway, talking about those next few decades, why don't we just go to them? This is when horror starts to look the way it does now. The slasher genre is in. It's not at the prime just yet, but it's starting. And that's the important part. We have such iconic movies such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Alien, and of course, Halloween. These movies didn't redefine the genre, they were the genre. This became horror as we know it. These iconic characters have stayed with us through the test of time, all the way from the 70s. These characters are 50 years old, and some of their franchises are still going strong. What? Horror, a lot of people would consider this as its prime. I would consider another decade its prime, but my god, I can definitely see why. This is where horror just became what it is. It's so important in the timeline, I don't even know how to describe it. Slasher movies were horror at the time, and they still are to this day. They are the one trend that throughout all of the rest of the eras that have come thus far has stuck all the way through, and that is because of these films. You know what next decade is? The 80s. Here we go. Golden age of horror, baby! Woo! Here we go. This is the most iconic decade of all of horror. We have so many icons, and what are those? Friday the 13th, Hellraiser, Predator, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Shining, and of course, my beloved Child's Play. You know what the best part is? Pretty much all of them are still ongoing. They either have a franchise going or they are so popular that their characters are still being used. I think that just shows how iconic they are. By the way, I am so sorry the lighting is getting slowly darker and darker. It's because I have been filming this video for 3 hours thus far. 3.5 hours. This decade is absolutely massive for horror. Yes, may not much development going on. It's just stuff going on from the 70s, but what it is happening is creating its identity. Everything is combining together into what horror is today. And even sequels to the 70s movies are coming out. Sequels to the 80s movies, for example, Friday the 13th by the end of the 90s had like 5 movies. So yeah, horror was really starting to build up its library, really started to build up its own identity, which it previously lost in the 50s. So the fact that it's only taken 30 years to be at an all-time high is mind-boggling, to be fair. New lighting! This is yet to happen before, but we've had to do it. It's taken too long to film, so now we've got lighting. Anyway, horror's fallen again. Are you fucking serious? Yep, they go straight from prime to fall again. Essentially, what happened is the whole slasher genre got overused again. Too many sequels that just didn't really do anything to innovate away from what they were doing originally, and that just caused the slasher genre to die. So why is this called the comedy era? Well, that's because of Scream. Essentially, the genre was dead, and Wes Craven was like, no, 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 I'm gonna fix that up. So he released a movie called Scream. Scream did wonders, but also terrors for the slasher genre. Here's what I mean. Essentially, Scream rewrote the genre, but basically what happened was, because it was part comedy, all the other franchises were just like, I want a piece of that. They all then became part comedy, which completely ruined them, because they were built on the foundation that they were a horror, not a horror comedy. So the immediate second you start bringing in funny things, it ruins all of the franchises, and then causes them to go into another ruin. So it was basically a ruin rise straight back into a ruin. Horror was doing not terrible in the 90s. Like, there were plenty of great movies that released, but it overall, for the iconic genres that they have become, with the slasher genre mainly, it has just been an up and down roller coaster, and it's kind of hard to tell where it's going. So why don't we actually figure out where it went with the 2000s? Two substantial things happened in this decade. One, reboots. Two, Saw. Let's start off with Saw and the impact it had on the genre. Essentially, what Saw did was make it so horror movies could break the boundaries in terms of gore. It cut off limbs, it cut off everything. Just blood, 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 blood. That's all the Saw movies were, and that completely redefined the genre because of that. Essentially, every movie just became extremely bloody, and to be honest, that isn't a terrible thing. That's one thing that always kept throughout the entire history thus far. It always felt like a lack of blood. It wasn't really essentially that violent. I guess compared to us nowadays, we're more condoned to violence, like we're a lot more neutral towards it, since it's a lot more covered in films than they were back then, since, you know, censorship and all that crap. But now that we've got blood, so much blood, things have changed, and to be honest, I think that's for the better. But what isn't for the better is the reboots. These reboots were not well received whatsoever, mainly because they cut timelines of franchises that were going on for 40 plus years. Okay, maybe not 40 plus years, maybe like 20, 30, because nowadays it's 40 plus years. You get the point. What didn't help is because a lot of these horror films, they had practical effects. That's what made them so real, so realistic, and so scary. A lot of these ones have replaced it with CGI, and they just really weren't well received. And also, like I said, horror is carried by the icons. Icons are the ones that bring everything. As soon as we lose the icons, like the monster era, for example, horror goes into a very bad state. So now it's either up to the originals to try and make good reboots, or for the new IPs. In fact, why don't we see what's happening in the 2010s? Now we're at a very weird point of the timeline. Mainly because horror is doing well. Like, horror has been very popular recently. But the thing is, the icons are kind of dying, in a way. Some of them made a comeback, some of them haven't. Some are said to make a comeback. So that's at a very weird point in the timeline. But it's also similar to the 1910s, how nothing really happened. I mean, we've got a few new IPs, such as Happy Death Day, The Purge, Paranormal Activity, and The Conjuring. So we clearly have good places to go in the future. But other than that, there isn't really much happening in this decade, which is very weird because you would think it's a very massive decade since it's the recoil after Saw and the reboots. So this is the one that kind of determines what happens later on, but nothing has really happened. I really thought I'd have a lot to say for this, but I don't. Nothing's really happened. Now we're caught up to where we are today, and to be honest, it's not really clear where this decade is going. We've got so many different subgenres such as slasher, paranormal, monster movies, or even Simon making a comeback. It's a very weird time. We don't know where exactly the 2020s are going, but all we know is that horror is sort of in a golden age right now. It may not have a specific subject or genre that it's focusing on, but what we do know is we are getting some quality horror films. The old IPs, the big boys, they're making their return. So overall, I think horror is said to go in a good direction. Nothing else to say here. And that's the end of the video. It has been a very, very long filming trip, but thank you so much for watching if you have made it this far. Make sure to leave a like if you liked. Comment on the comment section down below. What did you not know about the horror of history that I have just taught you? I just said horror history, but I don't care anymore. Down in the description below, there'll be a link to my link tree that will have my Instagram and Twitch. Twitch is where I stream. Instagram will be highlight reels, teasers to short films and videos like this. And yeah, that's pretty much everything. I hope you did enjoy. See you guys next time. Bye.